Hi, welcome to Daily Readings with Pastor Nate. Today we're in Matthew chapter 1. I'm not going to read the text, partly just for time consideration and partly because I'm not really sure how the copyright works on that. But I'll invite you to grab a copy of your favorite Bible and open up to Matthew 1. You can pause the video and go ahead and read that. I'll also include a link down in the description to an online version if you'd like to read that. So pause the video now if you haven't read it, and I'll see you in a moment. Okay, well, hopefully you've all read it by now. If you haven't, I hope you remember it real well because otherwise you're going to have trouble following along. But there's quite a bit that we could look at in this passage. I'm going to try to keep these videos around 10 or 12 minutes, so we won't be able to dig into everything, but there are a few things I'd like to look at. It's interesting to look at this genealogy. Matthew, our author, was almost certainly a Jewish Christian, and his original audience was probably primarily Jewish Christians as well. And so it makes a lot of sense that he begins Jesus' genealogy with Abraham. Abraham was the father of all of the Jewish people. Not literally, there's a guy named Israel who has that honor, but Abraham was his grandfather and is the one who steps out in faith, follows God out into the wilderness. And God makes quite a few promises to him, which is another important element of him being the beginning of this genealogy here. Matthew's not just connecting Jesus with a larger Jewish tradition. He was certainly doing that, but he's also connecting Jesus with some specific promises that were made to Abraham, and promises that we'll see Paul, especially later on in the New Testament, really latching onto and pointing out how significant they are for Christianity. One of those promises is God promises to bless all the nations of the world through Abraham's seed. And that promise is fulfilled in Jesus, whose ministry begins with the Jewish people, but expands into the Gentile world, expands to all people. And so Jesus is the fulfillment of that promise that was made to Abraham. And that's, again, part of the reason why the genealogy here begins with Abraham. Abraham was also a man of incredible faith. God calls him to leave the safety and security of the city of Ur, and he responds in faith and follows God out in the wilderness without a lot to go on except for his trust. And he's commended for that in the book of Genesis and also in Hebrews and by Paul as well. So he's an important figure, and it makes sense for the genealogy to start there, but it's also important for us to note that this genealogy of Jesus here is not just a highlight reel. As you read through it, there are some people of tremendous faith. There's people on here. There's David, who Scripture tells us is a man after God's own heart. And you have kings like Hezekiah and Josiah, who are some of the best kings that Israel ever had. But we also have some people on here who are a little bit less savory. Judah, for example, up here at the top of the genealogy, is one of the 12 sons of Israel, one of the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. And it's through his line that all of these kings of Israel come. But Judah himself was flawed. His oldest son had been married to a woman, Tamar, and died without leaving her any children. And so the Jewish custom required that his next son become her husband and provide or father some children for her, at least on behalf of his brother. And he fails to do that and angers God, and he dies as well. So it's time for Judah to give his third son to her to provide children for her, and he kind of refuses to do that. He's afraid that his third son will die as well, so he withholds that son. And Tamar takes it upon herself to trick and seduce her father-in-law, as she does so successfully, and he gives her the children that she should have rightly had through his son. So that's not the best story, but it's encouraging for us. I think it should be encouraging for us to see that this is the lineage that God has chosen, right? In some ways, we might think of Jesus as being locked into being of the line of Judah because there are these prophecies that he'll be the Messiah that was to come would be part of this kingly line that comes from Judah. But we have to remember that those prophecies were given by God. And because he had chosen this line, he could have chosen any of the other families. He could have chosen anyone in the world to be the parents of the Messiah and given a completely different set of prophecy to foreshadow that. But he chose to bring himself, his own presence into the world through this line of flawed people. And there are some great highlights in here, but there's also some of these low points. And this is the way that God chose to act. If you keep reading through, we don't have time to touch on every one of these, but we see Boaz, who you may remember from the book of Ruth. Ruth was a foreigner. She was a Moabitess. She came to the nation Israel with nothing at all, really. Her husband had died. She didn't have any family. She came with her mother-in-law. She was basically a refugee. And she came and trusted that somebody in her husband's family would take care of her. There's a custom called the kinsman redeemer, who was a family member who would take over the responsibilities of a husband from somebody who had died. And she trusts that someone will follow that custom and comes with nothing into a foreign land. And Boaz does respond and become her husband. But here you have this refugee woman, a foreigner, who marries into the line and ends up becoming the grandmother, I believe, of King David. And then, of course, we have David in this line. He's part of the highlights and part of the lowlights, right? He's a man after God's own heart. He's generally considered one of or the best kings of Israel. And yet the genealogy here reminds us that Solomon, his son who succeeds him in the throne, is the son of Uriah's wife. It doesn't even use her name. And David had committed adultery. And not only that, but sent Uriah into battle to die very purposefully, to cover up his sin. And so, again, God has chosen these deeply flawed people to prepare the way to be the background, the lineage of the Messiah, of God's own coming to be among us. And we should be encouraged by that, because I think a lot of times there's a danger for us that we might feel like God couldn't possibly use me. Look at my family. My family's so messed up. How could I possibly be of any use to God? Well, look at Jesus' family. You've got daughter-in-law seducing father-in-law. You've got this king seducing somebody else's wife and then sending the man off to die in battle. And then by the time we get down to these kings, some of these descendants of David's, some of them are really just brutal, terrible people, and they're committing idolatry in the temple, and they're abusing the people. And we don't have time to go through all that, but if you do a little bit of research on some of these kings, like I said, there's a couple of good ones in there. Hezekiah's good, Josiah's good, Asa's good for the most part. But there's quite a few kings in there who are not good. And again, it's a demonstration for us that God can use us. God does use people whose backgrounds aren't what we might think of as the kind of people God would want to use. And still, he chose to do that. He chose to act through this line, to enter into the world, to intervene in the world, to come and live among us and demonstrate his love for us in that way, which is just really powerful, I think. Our life sometimes can seem like such a mess, but there's this structure here, right, where we see 14 generations from Abraham to David, and 14 from David to the exile in Babylon, and 14 from the exile in Babylon to Christ. And to me, that just demonstrates a level of intentionality. Through all these messes, through all the highs and all the lows, God is working towards entering into human history. God is working towards taking on the fragile flesh that we wear and coming and dwelling among us. I imagine that at the time of the exile, the whole world seemed like it was falling apart to the nation Judah, the remnant of God's people. And there were armies coming and destroying their cities and dragging them away to Babylon in captivity, and destroying the temple, which had been the center for all of their religious life. And it must have been hard for them to imagine God being at work in that. The reality is that they had completely turned away from God. They completely turned away from the covenant that God had established with them. And we see Jeremiah the prophet at that very time, the time that the people were being taken away into exile. Jeremiah is prophesying, and he's receiving this word from God about a new covenant that is to come. And I think when you see how there's this kind of symmetry, there's these three groups of 14, and 3 is such a biblical number, and 7, which is 14, obviously two groups of 7, such a biblical number, and we see God's hand at work in that, even though they might not have recognized it at the time. Or if they did, they saw God's hand bringing judgment, bringing punishment for their failure to live up to their covenant that they were under. I think when you see how neatly organized this whole thing is, you do get a sense that this isn't plan B. This isn't God scrambling to pick up the pieces and salvage what he can out of the mess. God has been working towards his arrival. God has been working towards the Messiah breaking into human history, breaking into our human experience as a demonstration of his love for us. And that's important for us to take away from this, because we can learn everything there is to know, but if we don't find ways to connect with our Creator, we're missing the point. And I hope that these videos won't just be about acquiring knowledge, but will be about us finding ways to connect with God and grow in our intimacy of God. And this genealogy demonstrates that God has been intentionally working towards entering human history. And that's the real story of the Nativity. God took on flesh, God humbled himself and came down from the throne of heaven to show his love for us in the flesh. That gets us through the genealogy. That's only half the chapter, and I'm running out of time. You guys know the story of the Nativity, I assume. We hear it every year at church, and here in Matthew, the focus is much more on Joseph than it is on Mary, who Luke really focuses on much more. But in Joseph, again, we see, like Abraham, somebody answering in faith, somebody responding in faith to a call that God has placed on their life. Joseph doesn't even get to meet an angel face to face like Mary does. He sees an angel in a dream and trusts God's goodness, trusts God's plan, and decides to go through with marrying her, even though she's pregnant, before they've come together to consummate that union. And because of his response in faith, he has an amazing access to God. Joseph probably spent more time with Jesus than anybody else in the world. In that culture at that time, the two of them would have been working together every day, working in the garden, taking care of the family animals, laboring together, building things together. He might not have had the time that the disciples had during the peak of Jesus' ministry, but he had incredible access to Jesus throughout the first 30 years of his life as a direct result of his responding in faith. There was a cost to that. He knew that there was going to be jokes at his expense, that people were going to look down on him for marrying this pregnant woman. And he accepted that in faith, and because of it, he was rewarded with a real intimacy with Jesus that few people could rival. So I hope that that'll be an encouragement to you today. As you go through your day, remember that when we respond in faith, we're rewarded with intimacy with Christ. We see that through the genealogy. We see it through Joseph and his story. I hope that this was a blessing to you. If it was, feel free to like it or subscribe. Feel free to share it with others. This is my very first video ever, so if you thought it was terrible, feel free to say so in the comments, although it'd be even more helpful if you could offer some constructive criticism on how we can make the next one better. Have a great day. Bye.